I would challenge, if you are a practice owner, you probably spend time with a contact lens, somebody in the contact lens market, right? You may spend some time with somebody in the lens market. You probably don't spend a lot of time with your frame, but our frame vendors were super instrumental. I mean, they funded a lot of our spiff programs over the years. So we would go to them and indicate, like, we're going to turn off all other spiff except for your product. You get to pick 2 months out of the year. Our best supplier would get to pick the first 2 months, and it was always March and August. You can imagine, because those are 2 big months in our industry. But they were super helpful, and they were helpful in getting us access to things we just wouldn't have had access to just because we spent time with them, and they got to know what our goals and our aspirations were. And I even was lucky enough to help them with piloting some of their, what they thought was like harebrained ideas that they wanted to explore.
Thanks for joining me on the Power Hour, everyone. I am your host, Eugene Schatzman. We've got a great show for you today with an amazing guest. And just a quick reminder, please subscribe on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So in today's episode, I continue our trend of bringing on practice owners who have made an impact. And if you want to talk about real impact, there are very few people who can match what Jamie Rosin has accomplished. First, he and his team built Rosin Eyecare from 4 locations to 48 in a period of about 15 years. And we talk about a lot what it takes to succeed. He calls it the conversion engine of his practice. We dig into what a conversion engine really is for any one practice, whether you have one location or dozens. And we also talk about key metrics, recall, reactivation, behavior changes, so much more of the key ingredients that are necessary for that kind of success. Jamie is also very transparent about some of his tough learnings that he's had along the way. You'll notice how many times throughout the episode he talks about data, self-reporting, building a culture of measuring and identifying best practices. Jamie has gone from managing a small team to managing hundreds of people, and we dive headfirst into what he's learned about leadership and curiosity along the way. And that's one of the things I absolutely love and respect so much about Jamie, is how he's quickly able to synthesize data, his curiosity, his passion, his understanding of human psychology, and his ability to think strategically to make a huge impact on his patients, his practice, and our industry as a whole. We also get into the power of learning from people outside your practice and the impact that information sharing groups and coaches have had on Jamie's business. And you'll hear how Jamie's built other businesses to help solve problems for the industry as he started collaborating with other practices instead of viewing those practices as competition, and also as vendors, looking at vendors as partners rather than adversaries. So this episode is littered with nuggets and phraseology and lots of little insights that help build this incredible powerhouse practice. And what I find fascinating is that everything Jamie talks about is absolutely applicable, whether you have one location or whether you have hundreds. So as you listen today, I absolutely encourage you to reach out to me with your feedback. You can find me on the Power Hour website or on eugeneschatzman.com. I want to know what you get out of today's conversation, whether you want to hear more episodes like this or whether you just like to connect. I'm here as a resource for you. And again, just reach out on eugeneschatzman.com. And with that in mind, let's jump into today's show. All right, Jamie Rosin, welcome to the Power Hour. It's such an honor to have you here.
Thank you, Eugene. It is an honor for me to be here with you.
Well, and for our listeners, I think you're certainly one of the most accomplished people in the eye care industry, at least in my view. And the background I have is that the better part of the last decade, we've been working together at National Strategic for the better part of the last decade. And over that time, I have watched you add, I don't know, maybe like 35, 40 locations to your business. I have had the pleasure of co-presenting and seeing some of the industry involvement that you've had in helping shape the eye care industry. And quite frankly, I mean, the advice that you dispense on a regular basis to eye care practices is stuff that I hear people saying, oh man, that really changed my business. So just eager to have you on the show and eager for our listeners to learn from you. And I'm grateful that you were able to join us.
Yeah, thank you. That's very, very kind of you.
So, Jamie, I think probably easiest place to start is for people to hear a little bit about how you even got into the industry, and then we can jump into what you built once you did.
Well, as I tell my kids, who are all kind of the age of getting jobs now, it's a journey, not necessarily a destination. I first started I thought I was going to be a doctor. I went to med school for a year, hated it. I'm glad I did it. Checked that box and no, I don't want to be a doctor. And then I coached football at the college level and lacrosse for a couple of years. Thought I wanted to be a coach. Glad I checked the box. And I wasn't sure what to do next. And my father approached me, Rosin Eyecare, which was 4 doors at the time in the Chicago market, had signed a contract to do a joint venture with an HMO. And so he offered me the job of running that joint venture. And so I took it because I didn't know what else to do and managed the joint venture. We opened up about 14 locations in a staff model HMO back in the day. Staff model HMOs were it's a facility with doctors, and we managed the eye exams, which was a benefit of this managed care group. And they had a hardware benefit as well. And so I managed that. We ended up parting ways after about a year and a half. And at that point, I kind of was fully engaged in Rosin Eyecare, but more on the side of how do we take this small business and how do we scale it? And so I spent about a year and a half learning everything from how to grind lenses to doing daily closeouts to learning how to refract, learning how to manufacture gas permeable contact lenses. At the time was the latest in technology. And from that experience, then kind of organize the business with a organizational structure and job responsibilities, and started down the path of many, many learnings, not because I did it fantastically well in the beginning, but I was able to learn from my mistakes. And then over the course of the next 25 years, ran operations for the practice until we were about 15 to 20 locations. And then we kind of restructured. My brother, who's an ophthalmologist, became the friendly doctor, having conversations with practices that were interested in selling. And by about 2 years later, so we're in 2014, when we really decided we wanted to grow, all those conversations of doctors saying, yeah, I'm kind of interested in selling, were at the point of saying, I want to do it. And so we grew from roughly 20 locations to 50 from 2016 to about late 2018. So it was a really interesting run, and it was interesting how it accelerated. But that's a little bit of my experience along the way, meeting some really, really talented practice managers and learning a ton from their experiences.
Yeah. And, Jamie, as you're talking, backing up to, 4 locations and then maybe adding a few more, some of the people listening, there's lots of different lessons that go on at various stages of growth. And I think you've talked, I've heard you talk, and I've been part of conversations where, you talk about some of those mistakes and some of those critical things that you just have to get right. Otherwise, you're going to go back and you're going to redo and you're going to redo. And at scale, those problems really come back to bite you. So in your words, let's talk about what are some of those biggest issues that people should really be paying attention to if they're interested in growth? And what are some of the mistakes you made early on that you wish you hadn't? What would you tell yourself if you were, 30 locations ago or 40 locations? Right.
So I think that just thinking back on it, it's a really good question. There are different levels or ceilings of complexity that you hit as you grow practice. We were hitting a ceiling of complexity when we were 4 locations because we were dealing with multiple locations and a lot of different moving parts and a full surface lab. That was a level of complexity that I learned, structure is really important to be able to scale. And the other thing that was super important for me was really being in the weeds and understanding the business, not just like the concept of the business, but like understanding what it looks like to deliver a pair of glasses to a patient, what it looks like to run skills, pre-tests on a patient, what it looked like to train somebody how to insert and remove contact lenses. What were some of the doctor's struggles? So I think, we at 4 locations, we were at a ceiling of complexity where our structure did not fit growth. And we had to restructure that business. At the time, my grandfather and father would really be in the center. The organizational chart was like a hub, which was the two owners, and then every person reported out from there to them, and it just wasn't scalable. So, and then as we got to 10 locations, there was another level of complexity, which is now, too big for me to do everything. And so now how do I start to develop and grow people? All the while, and then when we started to scale real fast, it was really, how do you manage debt and live up to your covenants? We grew mostly by bank finance debt, which is cheap money, but there's covenants that you have to hit. And so learning, and our CFO was super important with cash flow management. Those are all mistakes that I made. I also think that as I look back on it, it's like when you're 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 locations, it is the time to build the culture of a conversion environment, meaning you build your conversion engine. So you're maximizing the footsteps on the carpet. And your comment about as you get bigger, if you don't fix that, you'll have such a hole in the bucket that you will be potentially insolvent, is what I learned. I learned that through trying to build out locations that were super beautiful, and that was too much money. And it's hard to rebound from either having too high of expense or too high a levered investment strategy for growth. You really have to be, you really need some cash flow management experience. So I made mistakes on the people side of the equation. I remember having a 360 interview of my direct reports at the time. I had an executive coach. I didn't know what I didn't know, but I knew I needed help in scaling the business. And I had an executive coach. And when he did his 360s, I came across as a very dogmatic, pounding fist on table, which was not my intention. And that's another mistake that I made in terms of how I treat my people and my curiosity about their struggles. And I think the other big mistake that I made was I thought that if I had the metric, I could just show my people and they would get better. And what I learned is in change management, feedback's super important, but it's really the behaviors. That was a big lesson for me. It's not the metric; it's the behaviors that lead to the metric. So it's not the exam only metric that we track like crazy. It's the doctor handoff, and then how the optician accepts the handoff, and then how the optician communicates with the patient. It's all about behaviors, and I think I totally missed that early on in my career.
Okay, so I want to come back to that point, but I actually want to come back to your earlier point first, because you just went through a whole bunch of things that you believe that if anybody's interested in growing a practice, they need to focus on. We talked about conversion engine, your management style, kind of the level of curiosity, being able to handle change management. I'm going to try to hit some of those point by point and really dive deeper into them. So let's hit the first one. You mentioned the words conversion engine, and you got to build that somehow in your practice. So in your mind, what does that entail?
Well, so what I would do is consume a lot of the industry reports, and I would look at like industry averages. And I felt like, well, we wanted to be better than the industry average. And at the time, looking at, for example, exam onlys, we were sitting at like 42% of the patients that came in for a well eye exam left with purchasing absolutely nothing. And when I looked at the data, the average was more around 20 some odd percent back then. And I thought, well, why are we so out of whack? And and then it was, let's not go from 42% to 20, right? Because that's a huge jump. Let's go from 42% to 38%. And how can we consistently get to 38%? What did that entail? That entailed obviously having goals and having a performer that looked at the impact of a 5% swing in exam onlys, because we wanted to make sure it was worth the trip, and it's totally worth the trip. And then sort of incrementally getting better. How do you get better? Well, what I learned is that most of your top performers and most of your bottom performers, if you said to them, what do you do to be so good? They're not going to be able to articulate what they do real well, typically. And your bottom performers aren't going to be able to articulate what they're not doing well. And so you actually have to observe and then have them observe, like the bottom performers, we'd have observe the best performers. We had our managers making sure that they were observing the handoff and the conversion every day in the office. Their role turned from kind of doing everything to I am going to look for what my top performer, because we had those metrics, what the top performer does, And then I'm going to help articulate to my bottom performer what I've observed the top performer doing. And so that was a really important component. So it wasn't just the metric, it was actually the behaviors. And it was having an incremental, not like huge stretch goal that you're never going to be able to hit, because people get discouraged when you're trying to cut your exam onlys in half. It took us 5 years to do that. But we got better incrementally along the way. And so I think that was a really important vehicle to help drive revenue and our conversion rate. And what we found, Eugene, is, at the time, I think I may blow this number, but I thought it was like we did about 12,000 exams when we started this whole thing. And 5 years later, we only did 12,700 exams. So only increased our exam rate by 700. We had not turned our attention to reactivation and driving and marketing at this point. And when we entered, I think we were about 8 locations at the time, doing 12,000 exams. We were a like $8 million business. 5 years later, with only 700 more exams, we were like a $12, $13 million business. We thought we were a $7 or $8 million business because we were behaving like an $8 million business. But in truth, by maximizing by maximizing the conversion, we were really didn't know it, but we were a $12, $13 million business. We just didn't know it at the time.
Well,
and that's pretty powerful.
That's huge. That's a huge deal. You grew your business by almost 50% by focusing on what you call the conversion engine, the exam onlys. Now, is there anything in particular that you learned about best practices when it comes to managing exam onlys?
Constant feedback and I would say awareness in the office. So the manager should know at all times where they are from an exam only rate and what their goal is. Whatever that goal is. We focused on exam onlys because we found it was the biggest bang for the buck. The next one was multiple pairs. When somebody comes in, buys 2 pairs of glasses or a pair of glasses and contact lenses. And those were the biggest bang for the buck. But it was building a culture of awareness. If I don't know where I'm at, any road will get me to, where I don't even know where I want to go. But if I have a goal and I break it down on a daily basis, like if we had a location, just round numbers, that let's say do 100 exams a week, and we have a 30% exam only, right? So that's 30 people walk, and we're going to reduce that by 5%, and we are going to have day by day that gives us X number of exam onlys per day, and then the whole huddle side of the equation, which is, does your staff know? To the point where our staff would have to go and talk to the manager when they thought they were going to have a patient that was going to be an exam only, so the manager could understand why the patient was walking. Because is there improvement? Was there something they were looking for that we didn't have? And many times what we found is the optician was very gung-ho and advocated for everything the doctor had recommended in many cases, but they didn't elicit, this is the other part that was a good learning curve, was the sales process. They didn't elicit pain or aspiration on behalf of the patient. And so when the patient got to the end of the transaction, it was like, with your managed care, that's $500 out of pocket. The patient was like, what are you talking about? So those were some of the things that really were helpful. So it was the everybody in the company was aware. Like to this day, we still report on a daily basis, every location, 48 locations in Chicago. We still will self-report how many exam onlys we had, sometimes the reasons why, how many LASIK consults we had, because how many LASIK referrals we had, and obviously what the sales were. And that goes all around the company every single night.
So
that awareness.
And I mean, this awareness and data component seems critical. So basically data transparency. And who in your organization has access to the data? Is it every single person knows their numbers? Does everybody have a number that they have to hit?
Every office has a number they have to hit, and every they have it in the break room. It's like, what's the goal per day for sales? What's the goal for exam onlys per day? And did we hit it? So on Tuesday, you'll see 2 columns filled in. How do we do compared to the goal? And we have emails that go out every night that says, hey, we had a really great day. Kudos to this office. They already passed over their budget for the week. Or, this one's lagging. We had a terrible exam only day across the board. that communication is just pretty constant, which I think is seminal to creating a culture.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So you mentioned data. The other thing you mentioned is the kind of the psychology of the way that you communicate with the patient. And again, it sounds like you found that through the process of analyzing the data and saying, who's my top performer, who's my weakest performer, and observing what the top performer was doing that was different than the weakest performer. But talk a little bit more about that psychology piece of eliciting pain versus just giving the facts.
Well, I think, so there's the handoff, right? The doctor says, talk to Jamie about, high index lenses. He is a fisherman, so talk to him about polarized lenses and anti-reflective coating. And, could even be as interesting as, and he, drives east in the morning to work and needs, a good pair of sunglasses. And then I think it's really important. What we found is that starting with, would you like me to explain the doctor's recommendations, or do you have a budget in mind, was a really critical sentence for our people back in that day. Because and 95% of the patients say, yeah, just, explain what the doctor recommended. I'd rather just hear what the doctor recommended. 95% of the time, that was the answer. 5% of the time, it was a budget. But it allowed our optician to go down the list of everything that the doctor recommended, asking questions about, do you have problems when you're driving to work east in the morning? Asking, clarifying questions to the patient. Doesn't take a whole lot longer, honestly. It's one sentence question with a couple of follow-up comments on what the benefits are of, not the features, but what the benefits are of the recommendation. And if the patient says, wow, that's a little too pricey, because you asked the question to begin with, would you like me to share the doctor's recommendations, or do you have a budget in mind? You can now go to the downsell side of the equation, which is fit their pocketbook, essentially.
Got it.
Which rarely happens, but it does happen. So,
and it sounds like you were able to substantially reduce your exam only. What did you ever get to, from that? I think you said you guys were 42% or something.
Yeah. So we got as good as 20%. And it really depends on your contact lens mix, because the exam only for contact lens, if somebody's coming in for a contact lens fit, there's a much higher conversion rate than eyeglasses. So at our best, I think we're probably around 92% converting from the CLEX, the contact lens exam only. And we were about 25 at our best, 25% on the conversion of a routine eye exam without a contact lens fit converting to glasses.
Got it. Wow.
So, and it blended for us was about 20%.
Okay. And I mean, you talk about this conversion engine. There's also something to be said about, having as many locations as you did. As you've had, is being able to drive patients in the door predictably. And I think that's been certainly you and I have worked on this a lot together. But the truth is that I know that you've shared with me that there's been some learnings along the way from your vantage point, even before you and I started working together.
So we historically have always hit people up until about 48 months. Now, we did it every 6 months through snail mail back in the day. And it was, the pandemic where you and I basically converted. But the other thing that I thought was going to be a little bit of a train wreck was when we converted to reaching out to patients every month after starting at 13 months. So 12 months is a pre-point. And if you haven't been in over 12 months, right, so 13 months or greater, we started to hit you up, and this is more recent during the pandemic, we'd hit you up every month out to 60 months. And we found, and you helped with the data, but what we found is every time we sent out a text, it generated about $6.47, something like that, which is a huge return on investment. And the other things I learned from you is, it's really, when you're talking about marketing and trying to reactivate your patient base, first of all, so many practices focus on all new patients, new promotions. And the reality is the patients that have come to you, generally speaking, like you, right? They then, and studies have been done on this, that if you are satisfying your patients, right, or your customers in general, they're more likely to refer and recommend people to come in. They're more likely to spend more money with you. And the interesting thing is there's some exertion studies that they looked at, and they actually consume less resources than those that don't like you and you haven't satisfied. And I find that so many practices are so interested in new that they're leaving the people that actually know you the best and are easiest to sway because they trust you. And that's where we spend the majority of our dollars, because over the years we've learned that driving new heads in the door, it does happen, but having the predictable nature is super hard and super expensive. And so we focus most of our attention on really just reactivating the 100 and some odd thousand patient database that we have, and that has served us really well.
Yeah, well, and I'll give a few more details on this. As the reality is that most people's what we found, and thank you for letting us use your giant database as a huge sandbox to go do some studies where we could get some really easy, really fast feedback on data, right? Because hitting a 10,000 person database is very different than hitting a 150,000 person database. You can learn some things really quickly with split testing. But I think what we learned, if I want to summarize quickly, is that most software will send reactivation, recall reminders, those types of things every 6 months for the first couple of years, and then they just sort of stop. And the problem is, and it makes sense why they do that, because they send the same thing. Jamie, it's time for your eye exam. Please click here to schedule your eye exam. And that's normal, and that's what happens. And the problem is, if you start getting that message more frequently than that, then you'll likely unsubscribe, and then that practice won't have a chance to communicate with you again. But that's what the software is set up to do. Having said that, what we found, and I think, again, necessity sometimes can be the mother of innovation. When you came to me and you said during the pandemic, like, we have a lot less budget than we had before, so we're going to cut our whole direct mail program, but we have some percentage of that budget that we need to go do something with. By that point, we had figured out that MMS, that's text message with a picture, converts at double the rate of a text message without a picture. So if I send someone a picture, and the picture, it can be anything. It can be your logo, it can be a picture of your doctor, it could be whatever. But if I send someone a text message with your picture, it's way more likely to be viewed and more likely to be clicked on than one without a picture. And I said, you know what, let's put some money in MMS, let's put some money in email, and let's try to just reactivate the database, but do it in a way that does not require, that requires us to test and split test. And I think we tested messages specific to age groups. We tested messages specific to genders. We tested messages specific to all kinds of things. But it was the testing, that size of that database allowed a whole bunch of testing. And one thing that we found consistently was that, first of all, you had to message someone for 6 months, or it was like 4 point something months actually, somewhere between 4 and 6 months consistently every month. But the trick was you got to send them a different message than you sent them the month before, and that message had to be value add. Otherwise, they'd unsubscribe. And we had, we were able to keep those unsubscribe rates really low, because even if you think about, okay, somebody has a 3% unsubscribe rate. Well, that 3% exponentially grows because if you're sending something out every single month for 12 months, well, that's a big chunk of your list that, probably close to a third of your list that's now gone at the end of the year if you're dealing with a 3%. If you're dealing with a 3% rate. So we had to keep our unsubscribe rates really low. And the only way you could do that is if you changed up the messaging and you had value add stuff every single time. And everything from fall fashions for your face to, to whatever awareness month and whatever. Awareness, And we tried to target that based off of the individual needs of the population. But that was one big thing, is that I think as we recognize this, the one huge overlooked opportunity is just letting the default settings of your recall reactivation software dictate how often and how you communicate with your patients who haven't been seen in your office for a while, especially ones after they haven't been seen for 13 months.
And it also is for me anyways, a good lesson in sort of trust but verify. Meaning, we were watching our unsubscribe rates very closely, if you remember the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, it started out the same rate it was before when we were contacting you every 6 months, like way less than 2%, maybe slightly over 1%, maybe. In some months, even less than 1%. But we were watching that very carefully. But thank God we did it, because we found how to predictably drive patients back into the locations. And it really helps your sales if they're coming back more frequently. And the other interesting component was, even though we're hitting you up every month, you still saw the lift in the patient response. And once you hit that peak, which was around 4-point-something months, right,
Mm-hmm.
or contacts, it started coming down, but it still was profitable as hell all the way out to 60 months. So
Yes.
it was kind of a great experiment.
Yeah.
And we split tested as well, to your point.
Yeah. So I think that's, that's a big one. And I also, there's so many different things we can talk about to help people learn. I don't think I want to, maybe I'll save for a future episode is kind of the right ingredients for a cold start, and kind of the things you learned when you acquired, because I mean, how many deals have you done for acquiring practices? So I think there's lots and lots of stuff here that I could bring you back on, and we could talk about acquisitions gone wrong and acquisitions gone right, and then also cold starts going wrong.
And de novos gone wrong. Yeah,
yes, de novos gone wrong, de novos gone right. In terms of the other side of it, and you mentioned this a little bit about your management style, and obviously, and this is probably why we get along so well, is because we both have a data-driven mindset. But I think you talked about behavior change starting with the data, but you also talked about management styles that work, management styles that don't work, and kind of how I think there's hundreds of people in your organization, but if somebody's got a decent size office, they might have, 20, 30 people working in an office. But even somebody who's got 2 people working in an office, what are the kinds of lessons that you learned, and what are the kinds of things that you teach your managers now as you develop people in the industry about how to make sure that they can get their teams buy-in and get the best and the most out of people?
Well, I'll talk about it from the perspective of thinking about me and how I showed up early in my career, and how I hope I show up, the difference between now and then. But I was super demanding. I was really demanding of myself. I was also super competitive. And I don't think those things, if you're a performer, like if you're the performer, I am the great optician, and my job is to be with patients every day. Being competitive and being perfectionistic and having drive is super important. But when you start managing people, and then managing people that then manage more people, right? So the layers, go from one. I'm just a performer. I show up every day. I'm a sole proprietor. I do exams on patients, and I sell them eyeglasses and contact lenses, and I find disease, and I turf them to, I either treat it or I turf it to an MD. That's a different mindset. But when you start having to manage people, that mentality sometimes can really not be to your advantage. You become very demanding in the eyes of your staff. And so a certain level of understanding, a certain level of being curious in terms of how they landed on the behavior that they exhibited, and looking for, and the other real important thing is, like, find them doing it right. Don't just find them doing it wrong. And I think a lot of, at least me as a young manager of people, particularly managing people that were much older than me, I was super demanding, not very curious. And I think that hurt my relationship and the trust that my people had in me. And so I think that the antithesis of that type of behavior is managing. This is the big lesson for me. When you're frustrated is not the time to have a conversation with the staff member that's frustrating you. You got to lower your level, because what you're going to say is not going to come across with the intention that you have, which probably is to make my people better, to make them more aware of maybe what they aren't aware of. And so I think that was a huge lesson. Like, when I started getting frustrated, I would usually use that opportunity to tell people what I thought. which was probably not to my benefit. But to walk away and like learn how to manage your frustration and come at it from a different angle was super important in my development.
Yeah, and you mentioned this a little bit, but the role of curiosity in business leadership. I've actually heard this quote attributed to you at industry events, where I think somebody said that you say you can learn from anyone if you're curious.
You're curious.
So talk more about the role of curiosity in both in your success and also in our daily lives as leaders.
Yes. Well, that's a good one. So the first thing I think about is when I came into the industry, my dad was in a information sharing group that just started up. It's still around today, actually. It's called Optical Management Group, OMG. We probably should have trademarked that. I think about that I was super curious internally because I was super competitive, like how these guys that were at that time had like a 10 location practice, which to me sounded huge, or a 15 location practice. And I was super curious to understand their story. And then I think as a leader, like, I think that I see the continuum as like curious, which means I am not going to think I know everything, and I'm going to actually ask. And you might say what I think I would have, that's what I thought kind of thing. But I think being curious is important because if you are curious, so there's practices out there that the listeners probably interface with. And that practice it's not your practice, somebody else's practice, but it's a colleague of yours. I will guarantee you that if you're curious, you can find at least one thing they do exceptionally well, and you can learn from it. And I think that was super helpful for me to be surrounded by a bunch of growing practices that I could learn from both their mistakes and how they would recommend avoiding that mistake. And then obviously, the humility of making a lot of mistakes and being able to share it so that other people don't, hit the same pothole, if you will. So I think that's it's a mindset, and it's a muscle that you can work on, right? To be curious, which is just ask questions about why they did whatever they did or what they were thinking. And I think that starts to create trust in a relationship. And that trust in a relationship is a super important lever in changing behavior. And then the other one is just feedback, like constant feedback. That's the other really important lever in changing behavior. But I think it starts with being curious. Well, what if we were to contact patients instead of every 6 months, every month? What would happen if we decided to self-report our exam onlys every day and know what, it's all this curiosity stuff. What if we started the conversation with the patient after the handoff with a sentence? We didn't know what the sentence was, but we kind of tripped over iterative weeks and weeks and having our managers try new things. This whole what if is a really important and very useful question to be asking.
Well, so it sounds like from a leadership standpoint, what you're saying is don't come in and say, guys, we're doing this starting tomorrow. You start by asking the question, what would happen if we did this? And you probably, in some cases, I imagine you might hear, oh, Jamie, that will never work. And then I imagine you could be curious about that too.
Yeah. Or you get we tried it, that's the other thing our practice is almost 94 years old. There's a lot of people that have been around the block years and years with us. And so you get a little bit of, we tried that a long time ago and it never worked. Well, it's like things have changed quite a bit from 20 years ago till now. Just think of what you do with your phone, 20 years ago versus now. It's like a big change. Think of what you do with your computer, your laptop. Think about when you turn on your car, what do you turn on the radio, or do you, plug in a playlist? Things have changed quite a bit. And I think even though you might have tried it before, it doesn't mean you shouldn't dust it off and try it again.
Right.
And then the other thing, Eugene, I think, which is really important, is you need to have some metrics to measure whether things are happening or not. I think many times there's this anecdotal nature in our industry, which is, I think it worked really well. Well, do you have data that actually supports that it really did go well? Because when you start looking at the data, sometimes it really it can help guide you. That's the measuring stick.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I think that's one of the core things that makes information sharing groups and even mastermind groups really effective is when you have things like data to keep everybody honest and accountable. I've been in situations where I've been asked to speak at groups where people just kind of show up and they say, "Oh, you know what? This one thing I'm doing is working really well," and it's fine. It might be true, but it might be working really well the one time you tried it, one time yourself. But is it really consistently driving results to the bottom line? And so I think your general purpose, general focus, and looking at data with a purpose is such an integral part of the success that I've seen that you've gone through.
Yeah, and I think that's for sure. That's how we measure our success. Honestly, it's really data driven, but it is important to note that it's the behavior that it leads to the metric.
Yeah,
it's not that was we talked about that earlier on this conversation, but I had it totally backwards. Well, I thought it was the metric.
And so how do you, from a leadership standpoint, are you just trying new behaviors to identify what moves the needle for a metric? Or do you have a mechanism to identify which behaviors you're trying to push for?
Yeah, it's really, so I'd say if you spend time and you have the data by performer, watching what they're doing, and articulating, synthesizing what they did differently than a behavior that didn't lead to the conversion, for example, is where the gold is.
Yeah,
it's just and that is, again, that's like another muscle that you can work on under the curiosity is a muscle. So is practicing articulating what you're seeing the behavior to be, because I think that then you actually can start to. Once you can associate the behavior with words, right, and know that is the key behavior, then you're in a position where your entire organization can learn from your own organization.
Well, and it's interesting because in our organization we call it observational intelligence, but building that observational intelligence is kind of interesting because I don't know that many practices and practice managers really do that on a regular basis, is observe what your people are doing. In fact, I bet it kind of feels weird to people to say, okay, well, the office manager is going to shadow this optician for 2 hours today. How much time do you think people should be spending observing and building this kind of observational intelligence about the inside of their practice? Owners, managers, what do you think?
It depends on the size, honestly. As you get bigger, you still should, so I think as we started to develop regional managers and then area managers, and we were smaller, but it was really their job to be in the stores all the time. And it wasn't in the stores, in the offices, on their computer clearing emails. It was really observing. So we developed like these observation forums, basically, that we would get together and we would meet with the regional, who would spend had to be at least a half day in every office that that reported up to them, to just observe and then share the observations with the manager. And then the manager would observe and share their observations with the opticians. And through that, you had like best practices, like the doctor handoff was super important. If we didn't have a doctor handoff, we were not going to do as well from a conversion standpoint. If we didn't elicit areas like what improvements would you like on your new glasses, for example, or what are some of the things that bother you about your current eyewear, like eliciting that sort of pain. So people will run fastest away from pain, but also fairly fast, not as fast as away from pain, but fast towards an aspirational goal. Like, I want to look like this avatar. I want to look cool in my new sunglasses. Like that's another driver. And I think that was what we spent a lot of time on. That is what the field ops team spent a lot of time on, was observing. Mm-hmm. And that's not for everybody, but it was a requirement for for us,
Yeah.
because we got a lot of insights. And we started, first it was, what office is most like your office within the Rosin umbrella? And then, what are you beating them? There was a certain friendly competition as well that was also established through the observations within a region, basically.
Yeah. So, Jamie, you also had the opportunity. So, as you managed your practices, I think you maybe leveraged that curiosity to build industry relationships and relationships outside the practice that really helped you scale. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, it was interesting. So I don't think it was a unique time necessarily. I think I think this kind of collaboration is available to everybody, but I'll go through the progression. So first it was this information sharing group with all these guys that were building bigger practices than we had, and learning from them over the course of many years was really helpful to me. Through those relationships, we started to, and we, talk about different trends that we're seeing in our information sharing group, aside from, how did you get that low conversion rate or high conversion rate or low exam only number? Like, what did you do to do that? And learning from them how they approach those things. Out of those groups, we created businesses because we had trust, and we also found that there was a need. And so those businesses, one of them was Optoport, which is still around today. It's owned by EssilorLuxottica. It's really a multi-door study group, if you will. It's a study group for multi-door groups. And we created Optoport out of a need because managed care was starting to grow. So this would have been late 90s, early 2000s. Managed care, was up to almost 30%. When I started, the only managed care we saw was Medicare, and it was like 2% of the business. Now we're 30%, 35% back then. And we were looking at around the room saying, if we're going to, and what's the discount that we're giving patients? And we figured it was about a 38 to 42% discount. We were basically holding the bag on, just us, just Rosin Eyecare, or the practices in the room in the study group. And we thought, well, wouldn't it be good if our suppliers could participate in the discounts we're giving our patients by helping us with bigger discounts for us to purchase products from them? And so we decided if we could consolidate our sales, this study group, we could all say we're going to go with one lens vendor, and we're going to go with one contact lens vendor, and we're going to go with like 6 to 10 frame vendors. We could probably drive more volume to our suppliers. It'd be more worth it for them to give us more discounts. And that was kind of the beginning of these collaborations. We also started a managed care network called First Look that we had sold to Unum probably around 2016 or 17. Another collaboration, that we could go and we could drive more heads into new locations we were building by looking at the business around that practice and offering that business the ability to come to Rosin Eyecare for, somewhat of a discount off, like it's just a discount plan. And that created First Look. So there were, and, the other one that's so under utilized is that if you think about, and we talk about this in the accelerator program, but is that if you think of the stakeholders, you have your staff's family, right? Because you're providing a living for them. Those are stakeholders in your business. Obviously, owners are huge stakeholders in your business, but your suppliers are huge stakeholders in your business. And so if you think about it, who else has your interests in mind? Your stakeholders, which includes your suppliers. And do you treat your suppliers like a transactional mindset? Or do you treat your suppliers with a collaborative mindset? Because to the extent you grow, that is to your suppliers' benefit because they grow with you. And I don't think that, so we created relationships with our suppliers where they actually helped us grow, like literally helped fund our growth. And that was super helpful. And, would even give us leads when they found a lead in catchment area, because they knew we wanted to grow. And they were like, if I'm going to lose the business, I'd rather go to somebody I'm already currently doing business with than somebody else. Or if I don't do any business with this group and they're for sale, I should introduce them to Rosin because they do a lot of business with us. So they were instrumental in helping us grow. And I would say really towards, towards the mid teens, 2014, 15, when my brothers really started to have these conversations with doctors. Our CFO took more of an operational role. I was able to, build a lot of relationships with our suppliers to help basically us grow. It was like a full-time position for me. And it led to getting to know VSP really well, which was super helpful, and getting to know Essilor and Luxottica and contact lens vendors really well. It was really very helpful to the business.
Yeah, and
didn't know it at the time it would be, but turned out it was a really good investment in time.
Well, and talk, as you said, we talk about this quite a bit in the accelerator program, but it's true that if you can identify the people who benefit from your success, who wins when you win, right? And you treat them like a partner, and you say, okay, let's work on something together that ultimately accomplishes a goal for both of us. Treating people like that versus just trying to, kind of bring the hammer down and try to negotiate just the lowest possible deal and treat them like crap. And, it seems like it's led to a tremendous amount of success for you, and also other practices that you and I have advised together too.
Yeah, it is really, but to that extent, it's not where people go left to their own devices, right? Yeah. Practice owners that just I would challenge, if you are a practice owner, you probably spend time with a contact lens, somebody in the contact lens market, right? You may spend some time with somebody in the lens market. You probably don't spend a lot of time with your frame, but our frame vendors were super instrumental. I mean, they funded a lot of our spiff programs over the years. So we would go to them and indicate, we're going to turn off all other spiff except for your product. You get to pick 2 months out of the year. Our best supplier would get to pick the first 2 months, and it was always March and August. You can imagine, because those are 2 big months in our industry. But they were super helpful, and they were helpful in getting us access to things we just wouldn't have had access to just because we spent time with them, and they got to know what our goals and our aspirations were. And I even was lucky enough to help them with piloting some of their, what they thought was harebrained ideas that they wanted to explore. So it was a really great relationship, and really did help us grow. And I think that those relationships, so practice owners that I could learn from, and that certainly could learn from me. And again, if you're curious, you can learn from anybody, because everybody does something really well, I'm pretty convinced. And then, this collaboration to start new businesses came out of those relationships. And then the suppliers, which were instrumental in helping us grow.
Yeah. So, Jamie, as people think about growth in general, there's lots of different things you have to do. You have to think about the growth of the actual practice. And we talked a little bit about that, how you could potentially grow. And I think I had Jay Abraham on a previous episode where we talked about increasing the number of transactions, increasing the size of transactions, and increasing the
3 ways to grow, baby.
That's right. So we're both, I think we're both Jay Abraham zealots, as he would say. Yeah. But as you think about all the different things that people do for growth, sometimes the things that people kind of leave to the side is growing as a business owner, and kind of understanding when it's time to delegate, and when it's time to, and what you're really good at, what you're not so good at. And what I've noticed is that as you've been telling the story, you've kind of found your own zone of genius. And some people, they feel like they have to do just about everything in the business, kind of like what you were saying when your dad did. And yes, you had to kind of do it out of necessity as you got bigger and bigger and bigger, and different locations. But at some point, it probably would have been helpful and healthy for you to do that earlier in the process before you had to. So talk a little bit about that, like finding the things that you're really good at, and then finding people who are really good at the things that you're not so good at.
Yeah, that's a really, I'd say I think the executive coach I had was really helpful in uncovering that blind spot. So what I guess my point is that you have to have, my opinion, is that if you have some smart people in your life that have different, background than your background, and you trust their judgment, it's good to have your own sort of kitchen cabinet to help you see your blind spots. They got to be honest enough to tell you when they're seeing something that may be a blind spot, because they're really hard to spot. And I would say the two most common themes I see on the blind spot side of the equation is the one extreme, which that was kind of me, like in the grind, totally in the weeds, probably too long in the weeds, and didn't do a great job of delegating and holding people accountable once delegated, with the trust and verify. The other extreme is the exact opposite. I think everything's fine because I haven't dug into the weeds and I'm not engaged. And you could be, it was like us when we were 8 locations and we thought we were a $7 or $8 million business, but we really weren't. We were like a $13 million business. That was because I was surrounded by these people that were growing, and it started me becoming very curious. But it's both those extremes that I see. And so I think it's important for you to have, and it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody that reports to you. It should be somebody that knows you, but you should have people that you regularly get together with and talk about your business, that can help you see those blind spots. Because without that sort of feedback, right? You and I have talked about Daniel Kahneman and the fact that, who was a Nobel Prize winner in economics, actually, but he was kind of a guru in change management. And I learned this from that survey company we had partnered with, Maze, the one in the Nordic countries in Norway, is that without feedback, you are incapable of changing. It is feedback that allows you to change. And if you don't have that kitchen cabinet, your staff's probably not going to tell you. They might, depending on your culture, they're probably not going to let you know when they're seeing a blind spot, right? Because they report to you and you're paying them to work for you. But having trusted advisors that you can regularly get together with, I think it's super helpful in getting you past some sticking points, or at least understanding you're in a sticking point. But I think it's those two variations. It's like you're super in the weeds, and you really need to learn when you're not serving your business well. And then the people that are not in the weeds at all and fairly disengaged, but think anecdotally everything's going well, that have the most to gain.
Well, and it's interesting because I think we've all heard this statement, which is that if you're the smartest person in the room, you're probably in the wrong room.
Yeah.
And the truth with everything that you're saying is get the right team of advisors to support you through whatever stage of whatever you're trying to accomplish in your business. If you're trying to grow, get the right team of advisors who have done it before. If you're trying to sell, get the right team of advisors who've done it before. But don't try to figure it out on your own, because you won't know. We really won't know if you're getting the optimal outcome, and somebody else's experience could save you thousands of dollars of mistakes and hundreds of hours of pain, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I think it lends itself to this convergent versus divergent. So when we talk about a study group, that is really more of a convergent group, right? You're all in the same business. You're all struggling with similar metrics, similar services, similar products. Like, that's really important because you can learn a lot, if you're curious, from those people. But the opposite is also super important, which is a divergent group of people, meaning they're people that aren't in your business. They're actually in other businesses. And what we've all learned, and this is a Jay thing as well, is that what is common in other businesses may be totally uncommon in ours, but yet very applicable. Like, why didn't I think of that? When we talk about pre-appoints, that's something that was really common in the dental industry. We stole that from the dental industry. That would be an example of learning from a divergent group of advisors, if you will. And I think this kitchen cabinet is really your divergent team, a divergent group of people that can help you, because what they see that's common in their business might be totally unique to ours, and you can learn from their approach. I think both are super important, particularly if you are looking at growing, going from 5 locations to 20 locations. Like, that's particularly important to have that, to have somebody. And I also think it's and you may want to have a finance guy in that, or the person that does your taxes in that group as well, because as you grow, it becomes super challenging to manage the debt that is going to happen as you grow.
Yeah.
And the mistakes you're bound to make.
Yep. And you and I have seen that in the group that we've led together, is that, I think people tend to learn. Yes, they tend to learn from people who are similar to them in their situation. They tend to learn from others in completely different situations, right? Somebody's got a $6 million practice and somebody's got a $600,000 practice. They can still learn from each other, even though it's not 100% obvious initially how, but it becomes obvious over time. And certainly they can learn from the people who are running the group too. So Jamie, lots of really good information here, and thank you for sharing some of your time and expertise with us. One last nugget, if you want to leave the group with the audience with something that, again, what's something you wish you knew, what's something that you that everybody should be aware of as they continue to go through the day, and even if it's anything about where you see the industry headed.
Yeah. So what comes up for me, Eugene, is that, so we talked a little bit about curiosity, and I think it's really important. I think our industry is going through somewhat of a transformational time. And it's driven by innovation, large language models, ChatGPT that we're all talking about, and how that's going to impact our business. And I think it's really important, if you are going to look at this industry as for the next 10 years, even the next 5 years, I think embracing innovation, even though you're going to fumble through it and make some mistakes, is really important. For me, when I was trying to grow our business, the big impact was managed care, and this huge shift from cash pay to managed care was a super big challenge. That was 20 years ago, right? Today, I think it's how do we embrace innovation and use that to further leverage the way that we engage with patients. I think that's a big one. So that's what struck me when you said, yeah, that's what hits me.
That's fantastic. I feel like we could do yet another episode on what kind of innovation do you see that's most impactful, but we got to cut it here just out of respect for our audience. However, if you want to hear Jamie back on the show, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to bring him back. We're, I'd say, good friends. We know where to find each other, and I'm happy that he was able to join us. So, Jamie, thanks again.
Me too.
Great episode.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate you having me. Thank you, and hope it was helpful for the listeners.
If you're enjoying the Power Hour, you might be asking yourself, what can I do today in my practice that's going to make an impact? So over the years, the practice coaches and consultants at the Power Practice have helped thousands of practices improve. And they often start with one thing, and that's a proprietary methodology called the Practice Profitability Audit. For about $2,400, they look at all of your practice numbers and they stack them up against where a practice of your size could and should be. It takes about a week for them to do. And because they're so experienced, they know what your potential looks like. And they're often able to take that $2,400, multiply it several times over, and hand it right back to you in found profits in your practice in months. Not years, in months, but you get to keep the much more profitable practice for years afterwards. But here's the best news. I'm going to tell you how you can have the Practice Profitability Audit completely free. See, we're really trying to get people onto the show website, which is, by the way, powerpractice.com, and then you click the Power Hour podcast button. The reason we want you there is because I want the audience participation. I want to hear your feedback, and I want to know how to make the show better for you. So you can interact with us, send us your feedback, offer your suggestions, and for a limited time when you go there, you can also request a practice profitability audit for free. Right. We're going to cover 100% of the cost, but only for 5 people per month. And 5 people per month is all we really have capacity for, because this is a resource intensive audit and the Power Practice coaches are generally busy serving their clients. But for 5 people a month, they've agreed to cover 100% of the cost. So it's totally free to you. So again, take action immediately in your practice. Go to powerpractice.com, click on the Power Hour podcast, interact with us, but also request a practice profitability audit today.